Claire.
Hi, my name's Clare Miflin from the Center for Zero Waste Design. I'm going to be joined by Anneliese Zausner-Mannes from Big Reuse and Nurture BK, and also Gil Lopez, also from Big Reuse and Smiling Hogshead Ranch.
Thank you, Claire. We also want to thank Susanna and Pam representing Snug Harbor in Staten Island, and Pam from New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx, who will be joining us for our question A today. We want to, question and answer, excuse me. We want to make it super clear that we're here representing the Save Our Compost Coalition, and are really honored to be here trying to help clarify and help understand what's happening with the state of community composting and the New York City Compost Project here in New York.
And I want to give a huge debt of gratitude to the Lenape people and other indigenous people who have stewarded the lands and waters of Lenape-Hoking since time immemorial. We're all calling in from various places. I know all the panelists are here in so-called New York City. And while colonization has largely extirpated these original peoples, we continue to enjoy so-called New York City. Beyond acknowledging that we live on stolen land and we are the beneficiaries of stolen labor, we assert that the Compost Project and the community composting at large are useful, dignified, and indeed necessary. As we repair soil, we heal traumatic rifts, working to separate us from the earth, our history, and one another.
Thanks, Gil. So I'm going to share my screen as we get started here. And we have the results from the poll right here. Great, so many of you take to food scrap drop-offs, but as you see, we have a variety with brown bins, backyard compost, community garden compost, and discard in the trash, and no judgment there. We know some of you are very far from drop-offs and don't have curbside pickup.
Can other people see the survey results?
No, I can't see them.
Oh.
That's okay.
Well, I'll answer them. It's 17% brown bin, 1% smart bin, 47% food scrap drop-off, 8% backyard compost, 19% compost in a community garden, and 7% in the trash. So just to give a little context at the beginning, if you want to know more about what happens to New York City's organic waste, we have a link here to a recording and slides from a previous event that was put on with the Solid Waste Advisory Boards. We will be sharing all this information, both through email if you're an attendee, or also at the Save Our Compost link tree. But the Department of Sanitation collects about 3 million tons of waste a year. Of that, about 1 million tons a year is organic waste, food scraps, yard waste, compostable packaging. And of that, only about 97% of it gets discarded as trash. Only about 2 to 3% actually gets separated and anything beneficial happens with it. So most of our food scraps from the city get disposed of, go to transfer stations, and then are taken by truck or rail to landfills like this one up here, the Seneca Meadows landfill, or to the incinerator in Newark. And there's multiple issues at every stage with environmental justice, with pollution of air, of water. So if you come away with, I mean, most of you in this webinar know, don't throw food scraps in the trash, but that's the basic bottom line. Next, I'm kind of going up the hierarchy here. Is municipal anaerobic co-digestion at Newtown Creek, where they separate all the plastic bags and some of the bigger branches, and these are kind of separated with this big equipment. Apparently it can be as much as 20% contamination, and then it gets turned into biogas, and then some of the resulting solids are put as alternative daily cover and things on landfill. Municipal composting is happening in Staten Island. That's the largest scale composting. Again, they have screening out of the plastics with that big tiger machinery. And that's what happens to the brown bins in Staten Island. But most of the other brown bins go to Newtown Creek. And then community composting can happen at what we're calling a medium scale. These are the largest scale. They're permitted by DEC. It's like Big Reuse, Lower East Side Ecology Center, Earth Matters are this larger scale. There's also Queen's Botanical Garden and Snug Harbor doing processing. And then there's a very small scale, the community gardens, the backyard composting, where frequently the material doesn't have to move at all. It's deposited and composted right there and becomes, it regenerates the soils right there on the site. And so on the Institute for Local Self-Reliance hierarchy, that is after not wasting the food at all and using it to feed hungry people, that smaller scale composting is considered the best because you avoid the collection costs. It goes right back into the soil right there. But smaller scale decentralized and the locally based are the next choices because they serve small areas. The compost stays in the community. It's made by the community can see it being made. And then it goes down. Anaerobic digestion is still way better than landfill or incinerator. So the different types of bins, the green bins that were at the farmers markets, for example, or any drop-offs, they get processed into compost, whereas the larger curbside and smart bins generally are going mostly to municipal compost, going to anaerobic digestion mostly. So what is the city planning to do? I mean, Plan YC that came out in 2023, which is Adam's plan, had 3 items under waste and circular economy, which is really launching citywide curbside, which as we know is in process, expanding commercial organic separation, and leveraging existing DEP infrastructure, that's the anaerobic digestion, to be able to deal with the increased capacity. They also have this citywide organic study, which is meant to be looking at what is the best thing and kind of evaluating the total amounts of organic waste, what's the best way to process it. But I think from what I can see from the budget cuts that that looks like it may have got cut or is being taken in-house. I know there's no advisory committee and stakeholders as they were first saying there would be, which is a pity because it's, as we all know, it's important to know what's the best thing to do with our food waste. The plan doesn't mention composting at all, apart from spotlighting Domingo's Green City Force composting, but he is not supported by the Department of Sanitation at all. He works in NYCHA housing. It's great what he does, on-site composting in coordination with NYCHA farms, but it's not part of the plan, which is on the right-hand side, which is mostly the wastewater treatment facilities and a little bit on the composting. But as we see down here, the solids from the anaerobic digestion really are not returned to the soil to grow food. It's pretty much soil, landfill daily cover, mine remediation, things like that. And now I'm going to pass on to Gil to go through some of the history of the New York City Compost Project. Wait, you're on mute, Gil.
Sorry. Thank you, Claire. This picture shows, I'm going to go through the history of the New York City Compost Project, which was started in '93, but I want to say some foundational points before we get to that point in the timeline. This image is from probably the late 70s and shows gardeners tilling in the soil. I just want to state plainly that community gardening and composting were created in the wake of fiscal crisis in New York City. This was a time when everyday New Yorkers were coming together to work towards community justice, reclaiming greening abandoned neighborhoods through composting and gardening. So composting, community composting has always been a social justice issue, and it remains a social justice issue. I think that there's really a strong case for municipal composting, but that can't really address the social justice things or the environmental, really, as we'll see as we move forward. Let's go to the next slide. I also want to mention that in that early times of composting, the Bronx Frontier development was a really interesting moment in the Bronx where some dedicated composters worked to reclaim food scraps from the Hunts Point terminal, which brings in a lot of food into New York City. They were also taking zoo manure from the waste produced by animals at the Bronx Zoo, and they were incorporating that with leaf debris collected from households and parks. And they were making compost. They branded it as Zoo Doo, and they actually sold that product. And from the proceeds of that, they were able to sponsor 9 different parks, including Barretto Street Garden. They ran nutrition programs, and they were doing all sorts of things in community centers and operated a farmer's market. So composting was the basis of regenerating community in the South Bronx. Let's move on to the next slide. And then in the early 90s, in 92 and 93, Department of Sanitation ran a pilot program for curbside composting, what we call brown bin today. They were in green bins back then, and they did this in Park Slope in 92, and they did it in Starrett City, Brooklyn in 93. Park Slope being a lower density neighborhood, and Starrett City being just below East New York, between East New York and the waterfront, higher density apartment complex. And both of these pilot curbside organic collections were complete failures. They ascertained that they had very low participation, and those that did participate had very high levels of contamination, which made the gathered organics so contaminated that they couldn't really do much with it. So later on in 1993, the New York City Compost Project was created. And I'm going to give that timeline now, but I just want to give credit to Margaret Minella, who in 2017 created this timeline, which is still accessible online. It's really great. Has a lot of information. I'm going to go over some high points. We're going to move quickly. We're not going to delve too deeply. And we're not really going to talk about things that don't have anything to do with the New York City Compost Project, even though there are a lot of things that happened that majorly affected the Compost Project. I'll just give myself a little props too, because I created a history of composting in New York City from basically colonization to 2020, and I presented that at Queens Public Library, and there is a video of that. It's an hour-long presentation that you can access through the Hunters Point Queens Library Environmental Center Program's YouTube channel. So in 1993, the New York City Compost Project was created. It incorporated partners from 4 botanic gardens: the New York Botanic, Queens Botanic, Brooklyn Botanic, and Snug Harbor. This focused on offering education and creating compost individually, as well as working with institutions to do something with their organics. A few years later, in 1997, DSNY started collecting curbside leaf debris, yard debris. This program was offered to residents in Staten Island and the Bronx. And then a couple of years later, there was a report commissioned by Department of Sanitation about backyard composting in New York City. It was a comprehensive evaluation. So the focus was on how people were composting in their own yards. And it created a baseline of understanding for New York. A year later, in 2000, the New York City Compost Project established its Master Composter course, which invited the public to small cohorts at each of the botanic gardens. And learn about composting, do some volunteer hours, and create their own project in order to bring composting awareness to more residents and composting projects throughout the city. In 2001, Department of Sanitation commissioned another report all about composting in New York City, a complete program history. It included a lot of information about the leaf collections that were being processed at industrial scale processing sites that Department of Sanitation was operating in Staten Island and the Bronx, as well as down in Brooklyn. It also talked about the education and outreach components of the New York City Compost Project, which goes beyond just the master composting course. Let's take a look at the next slide. And then in 2002, the compost programs and the education was suspended. Next slide. In 2003, the New York City Compost Project, with no funding, shifted its focus to creating compost in gardens. So moving away just a little bit from the institutional focus of trying to figure out how to get larger institutions and parks, honestly, to compost their food scraps, to helping residents in their communities compost their own kitchen scraps in their community gardens. So it was a kind of a major shift in focus for the Compost Project. In 2004, yard waste collection resumes in Staten Island and the Bronx. And I think it actually expanded to Queens and possibly Brooklyn at that time as well. In 2005, the master composting course resumed, and the Lower East Side Ecology Center was brought into the fold as part of the New York City Compost Project to offer that master compost or MC course to Manhattanites, who previously, I presume, either had to go out to the outer boroughs, botanic gardens, to participate, or just were excluded from the program. In 2007, once again, leaf collection and compost givebacks were suspended. In 2012, this is a pretty big milestone for the New York City Compost Project and composting in general. The Local Organic Recovery Program, or LORP, began, and it brought big reuse and earth matter into the New York City Compost Project as additional processing partners. So prior to this, this acknowledgement that the city is going to start processing food scraps and include that amongst the compost that it's collecting, which previously was only yard waste. I will note that the Lower East Side Ecology Center was also processing food scraps before, but I don't believe that the processing piece of their operations was part of the Compost Project. They were only funded to do education, as far as I know. But at this point, the processing that Lower East Side Ecology Center was doing, as well as the processing that Earth Matter and Build It Green, which is now big reuse, these processing sites were brought into the fold, and this is, a big inflection point for Department of Sanitation as they acknowledge that the food scrap drop-offs that these organizations were hosting at libraries and farmers markets and commuter stops and other places were actually part of a citywide and city-funded collection of organics. Let's move to the next slide. So in 2014, the city released another New York City composting report. Very useful to go back and look at that one. And they additionally added a pumpkin smashes in early November to a repertoire of events that were beginning to take shape for the New York City Compost Project. In 2016, there was a rebranding from the New York City Compost Project to the New York City Compost Project, funded by NYC Sanitation. In 2018, the Grow NYC was asked to take over food scrap drop-offs at green markets, which were previously hosted and staffed by New York City Compost Project partners. While Grow NYC took over the staffing of food scrap drop-offs at their green markets, New York City Compost Project partners continued to haul the food scraps from the green markets. So here I will note that the community composting, the community compost project, and Grow NYC are separate. Grow NYC was brought on, but the compost project continued to haul and process everything. These paid staff drop-offs in 2019 were outside of green markets. The food scrap drop-offs that the compost project partners were hosting outside of green markets in 2019. Department of Sanitation put out a work plan telling the partners to close or to transfer these paid staffed drop-offs to volunteer run or community-led drop-offs. Let's move forward. So in 2020, COVID canceled the entire New York City Compost Project, despite the fact that the governor at the time stated that waste collection was an essential service. The mayor decided that composting was not. New York City, also during 2020, while we had no staff at any of the compost projects, the New York City Parks Commissioner and the legal team began to try to evict composting sites that were on parks land. In addition to that, well, with that, Big Reuse and Lower East Side Ecology Center came under huge pressure because they had sites on parks land. Something that slipped under the radar for a lot of people is the fact that Red Hook composting site is also on parks land, but they got removed from this struggle to defend their land because the Department of Sanitation told Red Hook that they would no longer be able to receive truckloads of food scraps that have been collected at food scrap drop-offs. Instead, they could only accept food scraps that were dropped off by people walking onto the site, so from local drop-offs. So this removed them from being a larger processing site, which we talk about, which Claire talked about earlier, to being more of a community garden scale processing site. They have a lot of participation and they have a higher rate than a lot of community gardens, but this removed them from this dialogue when we were trying to defend composting sites from being evicted from parks land. In 2020, finally, at the end of 2020, some New York City Compost Project staff were rehired and we began offering services back to our partners in community gardens at food scrap drop-offs. We were collecting food scraps that volunteers were collecting from their neighbors that they had no way of processing. We continued to process those food scraps and we distributed compost as well. In 2021, dozens of food scrap drop-offs either reopened or new ones started to pop up as community-led programs. Here we have a picture on the upper left of Nurture BK. Down on the bottom right was Hockey. These were volunteer groups that came together to collect food scraps. Nurture BK popped up as a new food scrap drop-off. Hockey was created to fill the void of staffed, Big Reuse staff going to open and close the food scrap drop-off on Roosevelt Island. So they did that work instead of a paid person. And then there were still other folks like this group in Sunnyside, which took over a vacant lot and began a food scrap drop-off and started composting the food scraps dropped off directly right there at that lot. So this sort of things was happening all over the city. And then also in 2021, there was the announcement that Queens would get a pilot program of brown bins and curbside organic collection. This announcement came from the mayor's office directly. It came after months of Save Our Compost Coalition partners and New York City Compost Project partners working directly with City Council to develop a bill, and other people involved with the solid waste advisory boards, which are residents appointed to a board to advise. They're appointed by the borough president in their respective boroughs to advise elected officials on what to do with solid waste. But none of these people were consulted or asked about this brown bin program. None of us were invited to the big press conference that they had at the Unisphere in Queens. And it came as a surprise. And everything that moves forward about this brown bin is done in the same kind of shadowy ways that we will illuminate here. So in 2022, the ex-tech commissioner Tish was picked by Adams to be the sanitation chief. And she also brought with her about 30 people who have titles of deputy commissioner within the Department of Sanitation. These are people primarily with tech backgrounds. And the Bureau of Recycling and Sustainability, which is the Department of Sanitation, which gives the New York City Compost Project its marching orders, was drastically reorganized. Lots of people left. Many people were put into a different department. I understand now that there are 4 people in the Bureau of Recycling and Sustainability, which also handles, as well as composting, the safe disposal of toxic materials, e-waste collections, and other kind of sustainable initiatives. And so there's 4 people left to do that. In 2023, Brooklyn got its brown bins, and the orange smart bins begin to pop up in many neighborhoods without any details about how to use them, where they were coming next, why they were being placed where they were being placed. Kind of just like an opaque veil around these smart bins. So I'm going to pass the presentation over to my colleague Anneliese now, and she's going to walk you through the different partners and what they do as part of the New York City Compost Project.
I just shared the results of the polls for people who are interested at that point. I hope you can all see it on your screen.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you, Claire. So we did, for those of you who signed on later, we did a poll at the very beginning just to see what people were coming with, what before these cuts, how they were disposing of their waste. So yes, there are lots of systems going on. There are lots of things happening, and there's a huge past. We want to also focus on this situation right now. So underlying the foundation of the New York City Compost Project are these 4 kind of core pieces, which are in solid orange in the middle of the screen. Collecting food scraps, transporting food scraps, processing compost, and distributing. And I'm going to talk about what those 4 things look like in addition to technical assistance and street tree care. I also want to bring everyone's attention to the top 4 that all have these kind of taglines that say educate. By being present in all of these areas through all of these processes, we are educating. And I say we as the collective, we in community, as neighbors, as community members, as people dropping off or working in this field. It is very much something that just by being in your community, having a presence, through curbside outreach, through master composter training, more explicit, and then through working with volunteers, we are learning and educating each other on this process and educating people who do or don't know. I can speak for myself and say I'm continuing to learn every day. So there are a lot of dynamics that go into this. I'm going to start by just talking about collecting food scraps. So if we look at our city, we had over 200 drop-off sites, and that's represented by all of these green little dots. We had 7 of those, 7 processing sites. So if you look over in Queens, we have Queens Botanical Garden. If you go to the left, closer to Manhattan, we have Big Reuse's site under the Queensbridge Park. I'm sorry, under the Queens Bridge. We then, if you go down to kind of lower Manhattan, the Lower East Side Ecology Center had their site, which is currently under construction. Big Reuse also had a site in Gowanus, the salt lot. Thank you, Claire, for the arrow assists. If you go over to Red Hook, Brooklyn, the community farm that was helped facilitated by Big Reuse. Go north onto Governor's Island, that's Earth Matters site. And then if you cross over to Staten Island, we've got Snug Harbor, which is the botanical garden in Staten Island, also having a pretty robust program. So these are the 7 processing sites in our city that are funded through DSNY via the New York City Compost Project. So if we think about what it means to collect foods, I kind of drew 3 arms here. We've got staff drop-offs at green markets, places like Union Square. We've got community-led drop-offs, things like Nurture BK. And then we have unstaffed drop-offs, which is something that where you'll see a toter, but there's not necessarily a person there. It's access almost all the time or quite often. So let's talk about staff drop-offs at green markets first. This I made as we made as explicit as possible. Grow NYC and LESCC, the Lower East Side Ecology Center, are the 2 main drop-offs that are staffed at green markets. Lower East Side, I think at their peak, had 4 different green markets that they had staff drop-offs, and Grow NYC has over 50. So this is the staffed drop-offs that are at green markets, where you're dropping off your food scraps. Community-led drop-offs. This is a picture of my friends over at Nurture BK. These community-led drop-offs are facilitated through Big Reuse, Earth Matter, Snug Harbor, Queens Botanical, and Lower East Side Ecology Center. The 3rd arm of collecting food scraps happens, as I mentioned, at unstaffed drop-offs. They might look something like this, and they are collected by Big Reuse, Earth Matter, Snug Harbor, Queens Botanical, and again, the Lower East Side Ecology Center. So again, this is just collection. The next step of this is actually the transportation. Again, something else that needs funding. So we're talking about transporting food scraps, and that's done again by Big Reuse, Grow NYC, Snug Harbor, Queens Botanical, and LESCC. This is just taking your food scraps from one place to the other. This is, in my personal, very biased opinion, one of the most important parts of this process is the actual process, right? Turning food scraps and organics into compost. It happens in 2 different ways. The first one is community composting facilities. The second is a smaller, more local community scale processing. Community composting facilities look like this. So this is a picture of the Queensbridge site that I mentioned, run by Big Reuse, under, of course, the Queensbridge. It is in addition to their site in Gowanus and their site at Red Hook. This is very much a huge community composting facility. LESCC, as I mentioned, processed in East River Park, which is currently under construction, and the DSNY was building a temporary site. However, that funding was also cut with these budget cuts. Community composting facilities also take place on Governor's Island, at the farm through Earth Matter, the farm in Flushing, Queens, through Queens Botanical, and of course on the grounds at the farm at Snug Harbor in Staten Island. The smaller community scale processing, it looks 2 different ways. So processing compost, without getting too scientific, compost is a mix of carbon and nitrogen. It is, I'm sorry, excuse me. So carbon is essentially something that we supplement with wood chips. So, for example, Big Reuse and LESCC would bring wood chips to to community gardens across the city. Both of these nonprofits would help support community gardens who were doing a smaller amount of community scale processing. You can see here, this is Marlene. Marlene's at Kew Gardens, volunteer there. You can possibly see by the gates behind, it's a very small space. So community gardens are a lifeline of the city for many different reasons, but they can't necessarily process so much. In addition to the wood chips that LESCC and Big Reuse provided, Big Reuse also provided specifically the opportunity to cart overages. So that means that, for example, if Kew Gardens collected way too many scraps and did not have the space to process them, Big Reuse would come with their truck and pick up toters of food scraps and bring it either to the salt lot or to, well, Kew Gardens is in Brooklyn, so most likely it went to Gowanus in the salt lot. So that's processing compost. Distributing the finished compost, again, these 7 partners all distributed compost out back into the community, helping green our public spaces. If we go to the next slide, we can also talk about a little bit the Master Composter Certificate course. This was a huge, incredible course that I think most of us on this panel have completed. LESEC managed teaching this course and was directly responsible for teaching the workshops, hosting volunteer activities and field trips. They also facilitated this program across the city. Big Reuse and Earth Matter both hosted volunteer activities and field trips for master composters in training, and the botanicals that you see below, NYBG, Queens Botanical, Snug Harbor, and BBG, all taught master composter workshops in addition to hosting volunteer activities and field trips. So again, part of the program that's been cut. The work with volunteers, again, we've got all of our partners here working with volunteers. You might think, oh, volunteers, doesn't require a budget. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that enables these programs to actually take place. So while we love and appreciate volunteers, it does take employees that are paid to manage and coordinate the logistics around these volunteer opportunities. If we go to the next slide, technical assistance is a huge aspect of this program that these 7 partners provided in different ways. I'll let you read on the screen. These will all be shared at a later date, so you can kind of pause and check out what technical assistance looks like. Simply said, there are different people all over the city doing different things with food scraps and figuring out how it works in their neighborhood, in their community, and what that process is. It is a beautiful, beautiful mix. And it's actually just kind of we have to figure out how to do it well. And it's not, so linear, right? The weather changes, something else happens. We want to make sure that, we're staying as educated and sourcing materials well and making sure that everyone has the best practices and access to it. So it really is a collaborative effort with our community members, hence, New York City Compost Project. It's for everyone. So if you go to this next slide, we can also talk about street tree care. Street tree care was at one point done by these 6 organizations. The picture that you see is actually from an event that Gil and I worked. Gil and I are funded explicitly through council members. We are not funded through the New York City Compost Project, nor have we been in this role. But street tree care used to be something that was funded by DSNY through the New York City Compost Project. Unfortunately, again, that's been cut. So if we look at this breakdown and kind of consider it, what's happened? So 120 jobs were essentially at stake of being lost. Some have been reinstated due to private donations. But again, if we look on the right, street tree care, this is done through other organizations, some of these that are included in the New York City Compost Project and some others. However, it's funded privately or, as I mentioned, for myself and Gail through New York City Council members. If you look at processing compost, transporting and collecting, this is all, again, mostly shut down. Anonymous, there was an anonymous donation to Grow NYC that will allow them to consider the 52 sites and 65 staff members, 53 of whom are union. They will be able to continue through June. That's the end of the fiscal year, the end of June, June 30th. And then we've got $350,000 from Mill, which was shared with Big Reuse, Earth Matter, and LESEC, which is going to help support the collecting, transporting, and processing. Lower East Side Ecology Center, as I mentioned before, their site is under construction, so they don't have the capacity to process just right now. However, Big Reuse and Earth Matter are processing and still trying to help support the other aspects of it. So that's where we are now. I'm going to pass it back over to Claire.
Actually, to Gil. girls taking this part. And I just want to let people know that if you have questions for the Q&A, please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, and we'll be able to answer them when we finish the panel.
Sorry, I was muted. So there's been a huge response from everyone, not everyone, but so many people. And the media has really picked up this story. Of course, there's a lot of people interested. The media plays an important role in conveying what is happening. We have in large here, one of the headlines that I think conveys what's happening best. Eric Adams just cut the only NYC compost programs that ever worked. And there were some other stories with varying degrees of support for one side or the other. Obviously, the media is not exactly unbiased, but sometimes it reports a little bit better than others. So there was a lot of media response from this. Lots of news to read. We have lots of articles. We have a whole link tree with just a bunch of articles if you want to go spend a whole day reading about what's been happening from the media perspective. And there's also been the community response. Grow NYC created a petition where, you know, on the graphic down on the bottom right, it says that 48,942 people signed it. I think it's up to 50,000 now. I think we met the goal, but we also held 2 rallies outside of City Hall, one of them being a press conference, and we had another rally at Gracie Mansion last month. And then we had a letter to the mayor that was signed by all of these organizations and nonprofits here in New York. So there's been huge community response and support for community composting in New York City. And then on the next slide, we see the city council response. So Sandy Nurse, as the former leader of the sanitation committee on city council, co-authored a letter with 28 other council members co-signing and 4 borough presidents. And they were in full support of New York City Compost Project. And they made it clear that this project should not have to look to private funding. This is something that New York City benefits from. New Yorkers benefit from this, and New York taxpayers should fund this initiative. We should not have to look to private grants to get this very important work done. And from Mayor Adams, we have a continuation of on one hand, zero dialogue with anyone who knows anything about composting in New York City, and these press conferences and media releases, and feeding the press information that is a little bit contrary and very confusing. So instead of actually addressing the 50,000 person petition, the letter to the mayor, the various city council people, instead of addressing any of that, he just had a press conference saying that the Staten Island composting facility at Fresh Kills has been expanded. It looked really good on paper. He neglected to mention that he didn't have much to do with any of that project. It was initiated and primarily built and constructed before he was the mayor or Commissioner Tisch took her position. But he's really good at taking credit for these things. And then in addition to adding more confusion and talking about things that don't really have much bearing, I mean, like when he says that the composting has been expanded 2,000% and that composting is happening, hassle-free curbside composting, he's kind of not being truthful, because what gets picked up in Staten Island goes to Staten Island, to Fresh Kills. But we know that most of the material, based on his report, his Plan NYC Getting Sustainability Done report, they are prioritizing turning the majority, as much food scrap and organic, into biogas for their waste to energy scheme. So he never really says that. He always says that he's composting. He talks about the brown bin. He talks it says composting on the orange bins, and even though very few of them, unless they're in Staten Island, actually get composted. But in addition to further confusing the issue and not addressing the issue, he also has not refunded the program through the PEG funding initiatives in this last budget go round. And furthermore, he has also released the 2025 fiscal budget, preliminary budget, which gives zero money to the New York City Compost Project. So this is not something that that is just going to get refunded next year. This is something that Mayor Adams continues to deny money to, and it's something that we're going to have to continue to talk about and actually fight to get refunded. We're going to talk about raising private funds in a little while just to get us through to when the city actually refunds the program. And it's really important to know that the city has no intentions at this point in actually refunding anything for the New York City Compost Project or community composting partners. So here's our call to action. We are trying to raise money. We do not believe that private funding is the correct way to do this. Everyone that we're asking to donate money has already paid their taxes, and we should already get these services. So we're looking to fund the New York City Compost Project partners, and there's some confusion about who that is. As I mentioned earlier, Grow NYC, they got a private donation to continue collecting food scraps at their green markets. Grow NYC does not process food scraps. When they got that donation, they got in touch with DSNY and they started bringing all their food scraps to Staten Island. That is not a community composting site. That is an industrial composting site. I just got word today that Grow NYC now has an agreement with Earth Matter and Queens Botanic Garden and will be bringing some of their food scraps on Mondays to those two places on a recurring basis. The details are still fuzzy, and it's unclear how much material, if any, they're bringing to the biodigester at Newtown Creek or Fresh Kills. We do know that they were bringing material to the biodigester prior to the budget cuts, and they weren't bringing much to Fresh Kills, but they were bringing some over there. So it's good to see them starting to move back. But in order for us to keep the processing sites open, we've got some private donations, and there was $350,000 donated from a for-profit company called Mill, and that was divided evenly between 3 of the New York City Compost Project partners: Big Reuse, Earth Matter, and Lower East Side Ecology Center, so that we can keep a bare minimum service. We get to keep the Queensbridge processing site open, but we don't have enough funding for the 3 employees required to do that to go all the way until the next budget year. We still need to raise more money. And that's the same with Earth Matter doing the processing at their site and Lower East Side Ecology Center collecting food scraps and processing some of it where they can. So we have a graduated fundraising initiative, $540,000 to restore funding for basic compost processing at Big Reuse, Earth Matter, and Lower East Side Ecology Center. We're, a little over halfway to that mark, thanks to a large, generous donation from a for-profit company, but we still have a good ways to go to get there. We would need $1 million to restore the expanded operations across composting sites, and processing capacity at the Botanic Gardens, and to reopen food scrap drop-off locations. So there's lots of community-led food scrap drop-off locations that previously got food scraps picked up after they volunteered to collect it from their neighbors. They can no longer collect those food scraps because the Compost Project partners don't have the money to pay drivers to pick those food scraps up. We need to raise that $1 million to refund the jobs to get out to these community-led food scrap drop-offs. The $1.5 million would refund all 7 organizations across the New York Compost Project. So that would include the 3 here on the screen, as well as all the botanic gardens. And $2 million fundraising would restore all community composting operations and uplift unfunded community-based composting partners. So that is our ask. And we have some other ways that we're going to talk about later to participate that aren't purely financial. Let's move on. I think Claire's going to be taking back over the slides now. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm going to put it in a larger context. I mean, $2 million or fully funded, I think the Compost Project was about 7 million a year, but still that is a really small amount when you think how much it does to support the larger vision of the city since 2007. I mean, Mayor Bloomberg invested 9 billion in green infrastructure, 1 million trees, huge investments in making our city greener. De Blasio added like resilience, social and climate resilience goals, and like addressing inequality. Adams had in the other sections of this plan, incentivizing stewardship of green spaces. Who does that better than, you know, helping street trees with compost, adding compost to small community gardens and parks? You know, community composting is not just what to do with food scraps and food waste, and should be understood as far more beneficial and not just under Department of Sanitation to benefit. It benefits so much more of the plans for the city. And many of Adam's initiatives, like he has a rat mitigation czar, a public space czar. He's changed zoning to actually allow distributed composting citywide. He has an Office of Urban Agriculture who well realizes the benefits that community composting bring to community gardens and urban gardens growing food. And then as well, there's been this urban forest agenda bill. So community composting needs to be ramped up greatly and not defunded. And I think if the administration really understood all the things and benefits it brings, it would realize that it really does fit into its plans and has for 3 administrations. Because all the rain gardens, again, we're spending another couple of $2 billion on rain gardens. They're really important. They allow stormwater to filter in and infiltrate so we don't have sewage going into our waterways, but we need to maintain them. And best practice is to add compost every year, because compost can hold like 6 times its weight in water. It can allow soils to absorb up to 80% of a 4-inch rainfall. So it can really reduce flooding. And rain gardens are designed for that initially, but over time, the soil compacts down and breaks down, and you have to add more compost to keep it performing well. And you also have to clean away the litter and do other maintenance. And on the right here, we see the Rain Coalition, who are like seeing how you can also do this you can invest in green infrastructure maintenance in a way that can forward economic justice if you partner nonprofits who work in their neighborhoods and engage their communities and have a path to green jobs, as well as some volunteers to help maintain. The same with planting street trees. They've actually found a study looking at the 1 million trees, found that many people, it was their first act of volunteerism to help plant and take care of street trees, and it led to them to be more civically engaged in their communities afterwards. So the kind of work that community composting does to engage communities is hugely beneficial for the city, and it's really short-sighted to cut something that is really such a small part of the city's budget when it achieves so many of the city's aims. Here on the left, you know, urban agriculture is a big passion of the mayor's. And here on the left, we see, you know, from Green City Force, featured in their Plan YC, a great organization, Compost Power, that works with Green City Force at Night Farms. And residents can bring food scraps to the compost site, or they can volunteer, and then they get free food grown right there in their development in return. So it really just makes it tangible how the loop of food scraps to compost to healthy soil to healthy eating works. And same in school gardens, which are supported by New York City Compost Project as well. And they also allow kids to eat more healthy, but even just playing in compost-rich soil helps kids' immune systems and their microbiome. And then, I mean, it's pretty obvious that community composting, community gardens, local farm stands all work really well locally to support healthier diets. I just want to acknowledge as well, we've been talking exclusively in this teach-in really about the New York City Compost Project, but there are a load of other community compost organizations that are part of the movement, that are part of Save Our Compost, like BK Rot, Green Fiend, Common Ground Compost, and Micro Haulers, Fakashi, who will collect food scraps for a fee from commercial and residential properties. Some, like BK Rot, then took an empty lot and turned it into a community garden. There are also parks like Battery Park City Authority, Riverside Park, who are processing and making compost in the park. In Battery Park City, it's been going on for years. They take food scraps and yard waste, and they use the resulting compost to keep that park so beautifully green and healthy. So we can see it can be done at the scale of the park, but it can also be done at a slightly larger scale, as we see here at Queensbridge. This is the site for big reuse, where they take food waste from all these drop-offs, or they did around, and then they processed it in the Queensbridge site, and then they delivered it to community gardens and as part of street tree care, and also Parks Department, from the actual Parks Department, Parks Astoria, and these parks would bring their horticultural waste, leaves and tree trimmings right here, really convenient local place to bring, and then they could take really good quality compost back to make their parks greener. So this really cut the transportation. You don't need to transport it even to the municipal site in Staten Island. You have the composting right here, and these local loops are what we need to develop further in the city to make sure everybody has this kind of local processing. I live right by Prospect Park, and I see all the time, I see leaf collection and all these bagged leaves, and I see piles of tree trimmings. I see the largest food scrap drop-off in the city. I think that you can get almost a ton even of food scraps sometimes at Grand Army Plaza. I see the dry compacted soil that hasn't had compost added to it at all, or it wouldn't be dry like this. And then I see the flooding because it isn't kind of really good at acting like a sponge. So these things could be solved right here in the park. And we kind of did some calculations to see how that could happen. And we saw, okay, if we take the 200 acres of lawn space in Prospect Park, if you added a 1/4 inch of compost a year, we kind of did back of the envelope calculations. It would be about 85,000 households. This shaded area, we said 50% of their amounts of food scraps. That could be because they've reduced, there is a city goal to reduce our food waste by 50%, or partial participation, whatever, about this area could drop off their food scraps in the park. It would only take less than 1% of the area. I mean, these little orange rectangles, there are plenty of maintenance areas in the park. It's not a large area to spend on maintaining the soils of the park. And then here on the right, we see it would change soil from looking like this, all compacted, to looking like this on the right, which is actually, both these photos were taken in Fort Greene Park, and this was after big reuses compost had been applied. And you see how much healthier and greener it is. And now I'm going to pass over to Anneliese to just finish off. Oh, you know what? I'm going to have to stop this share and get the video up, because this was from a PDF rather than the Google Slides, which had the video. So we can hold a second here while I'm bringing that up. Please do put your questions in the Q&A, and
thank you, Claire. I'm also, while Claire is uploading this video, what it is, it's a quick 2-minute video compilation taken the last, I guess it was the middle of December. We had several of our friends and colleagues at different community gardens and food scrap drop-offs across the city. just ask their neighbors why do you compost? What is it? We put together a very quick 2-minute video just to give you an idea to see and to hear what we see and hear and experience. Perfect. So as we said before, we will be sharing this. Really simply said, this is, a handful of photographs from us, just what community actually means. Community is something that can't be manufactured. Anyone who knows me knows that for me, what it means to kind of live in New York is very much tied to myself and my family. My mom's first generation Brooklyn born. Was born and raised in Brooklyn, and my father moved to this country for my mother. So I grew up in a very tight-knit community of aunties and neighbors and community members who all looked out for each other and watched out for each other. And it's a huge part of, I think, who I am as a person and what made what makes New Yorkers New Yorkers and what makes all of us who we are. So just remembering that this project, this New York City Compost Project, is about community composting. It's more than just the soil and the earth and the remediation. It's also about the people, and they're real. They're in these, well, they were in these photos. We're now looking at references, but they were in those photos, all those smiles, all those eyes, all those hands in the earth, on the earth. It's really important and it's powerful and something that we're really hoping we can find and encourage everyone here to participate in if they're not already. And bring back the true community of and in community compost. So with that, I'd love to transition to question and answer. And I want to, again, highlight for those of you that came on later, both Pam and Susanna, who are joining us. Pam from NYBG, the New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx, and Susanna from Snug Harbor Botanical Garden in Staten Island, to specifically speak to any questions that you may have around this, what this might look like in the Bronx and in Staten Island. As you all may know, we did and we're able to do this in Brooklyn and in Queens. We'll be in Manhattan on Saturday, but we also want to give our love to the Bronx and Staten Island. So with that, we open it up. Again, as Claire said, you're welcome to write in Q&A or in the webinar chat, and we will happily answer all of your questions as best we can.
Do you want to direct the questions, Anneliese?
Direct them as in read them off? Yeah, I'm happy
Or
to.
suggest, or Pam, I mean, people could just choose one from the Q&A.
Yeah, is there anything that any of the panelists read, specifically Pam, Susanna, that you read that you wanted to speak to?
No, I'm going through the questions now. Nothing stands out.
Okay, I'm happy to. I'm sorry, Pam.
No, nothing stands out that's specifically Bronx related. So
Okay, well, Bronx gives their love right back to you. So one question says, in your opinion, what is the ideal long-term solution for composting in New York City? Is it community compost sites and DSNY curbside working together? And what can DSNY collection program change to be more beneficial to communities? Anyone want to start?
I'm sorry, which question was it?
I'm just going to repeat it. What's the ideal long-term solution for composting in New York City? So is it community composting sites plus DSNY working together? And what can DSNY collection program change to be more beneficial to communities?
I would say it is both. Yeah, sorry, Gil,
Go ahead,
you can
Claire.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I would say it's definitely both. We need to bring back community composting as it was and make it bigger and better and expanded fully to all boroughs, and support it further and tie it into the green infrastructure maintenance. But there is also a place for the curbside collection, and they can work really well together. And I think that's what Gil was going to answer. So go ahead, Gil.
Yeah, at the previous two of these that we've done in person at the Brooklyn Library and Queens Library, I during the question and answer, I made a point because some people have asked, like, should we use the brown bin? And the answer is, it depends. I mean, I use my brown bin. I put all of my meat, bones, and dairies into the brown bin, and I let Department of Sanitation take it and do their industrial scale whatever with it. I bring all of my veggie scraps to my community garden and process it. I think that the brown bin is really important because we have been fighting. The New York City Compost Project partners have been fighting for mandating compost, and that's exactly what's happening. But the problem here is, while we've been fighting for mandating compost, we understand that as the city rolls out this curbside collection service and millions of New Yorkers begin to participate, our fairly small programs cannot accept that amount of compost, and we can't process the meat, bones, and dairy, the full urban diet. So there has to be some other way to do something better than landfill that material. So there was capacity for the digestion at the digester eggs at the wastewater treatment plant at Newtown Creek. So the mayor and the DEP and all the smart people got together and they said, well, we'll just use the capacity to process some of these food scraps. And I think that is wonderful because sending things to the sending organics to the landfill closes the loop. It ends the cycle for carbon, which is the foundational basis of life on Earth. We're all carbon-based life forms. The trees, the fish, the birds, the bees, us, the plants, everything that is alive has carbon and water in their cells. And we need that. And when we send our carbon nutrients to a landfill, that is not okay. When we send it to be biodigested to make heat and energy, that's a better thing than landfilling it, but it's still taking those resources away from the life cycle to create a flash of energy so we can have a little bit of time on our cell phones and computers. When we create actual soil, that is important. The industrial scale composting facilities require a lot of trucking, which is embodied energy. Everything from the materials made to make that truck to the diesel that goes in it to transport it. And the people that are, driving it and staffing it, that's a lot of resources. We're driving through communities. I mean, if the mayor is telling us the truth that compost collected in the boroughs is going to Staten Island, then everything from the North Bronx, East Queens is trucked through multiple boroughs over the Verrazano Bridge. Can you imagine? Are we going to be calling the neighborhoods that are entering into Verrazano Cancer Alley in 5 or 6 years because of the increase in cancer due to all the trucks? There's huge impacts to transporting. So keeping things as local as possible is really important. And all the Compost Project partners support the brown bin. We really do. But when the brown bin is when our programs are used to greenwash the brown bin program, that's not okay. Our understanding was that we're going to fill this capacity need with the lesser of many evils by, instead of sending organics to the landfill, biodigesting it or co-digesting it with sewage and or industrial scale processing. But we also understood that we were going to increase the amount of community composting happening in all districts of New York City and all boroughs and districts so that people can see where their food scraps are going, so people can understand the importance of doing this locally, so people can participate if they choose to in breaking down their organics. And instead, we're getting the exact reverse of that. People who want to participate in handling their own wastes responsibly are being told that we are not going to be supported in any way, shape, or form. And that's not okay. We support the brown bin, but we also support people being autonomous with their food scraps.
Thank you, Gail. I just want to get to a few other questions that are coming in. One of them, how can we understand more about the negative effects of the bio-waste fuel? Many of the composters I chat with in the city respond negatively to the electric bins. I think you're discussing or mentioning the smart bins. Is this the waste to energy scheme? I don't think many people understand it's negative because of the language of bio-waste. I think you're alluding to greenwashing and just like confusion that comes from the word compost versus, composting and where it's put. I can speak specifically to what we discussed, and I think Claire mentioned this earlier in the presentation. It's really important to understand the difference between anaerobic digestion and anaerobic co-digestion. Anaerobic digestion would be just organic material. Anaerobic co-digestion integrates sewage. As a result, the analogy I often give is a juicer. If anyone's ever juiced a vegetable or fruit, there's the liquid that comes out, and there's a pulpy byproduct that you might put in your bin to be composted. The process of anaerobic co-digestion is similar. Co-digestion, including sewage, and anaerobic digestion, period. Both of them go through a kind of similar process where you end up with what's called this sludge, this slurry, this byproduct, biosolids, excuse me, is what it's called. When anaerobic digestion is co-digestion, meaning when it's involving sewage, that byproduct, those biosolids, are heavily contaminated with all kinds of PFAS and just nasty stuff. So it cannot be composted, and it must be sent to a landfill. When anaerobic digestion is done with pure organic material, those biosolids can be composted because, again, all the material that went in was organic. So I think that's kind of understanding and really clarifying that the anaerobic digestion that's happening in our city is anaerobic co-digestion. I think that's really important for understanding and integrating the understanding of what it means to mix sewage in and what that means for the byproduct that comes out.
While still staying clear that we still really support that above landfilling and incineration. So although,
of course,
yeah, because we hear a lot of negative things about it, but it allows a huge amount of food scraps to be processed, and it allows meat and dairy. And I keep putting the link. You can just look at the slide deck or the recording to a previous presentation that really goes into depth, has representatives from DEP, Sandy Nurse moderates it, looking at the different types of processing. But yeah.
I'm going to go on to another question. But we do, of course, we support all of this. It's a continuum. We're not saying it's one thing or another. We're just bringing attention to the misunderstandings that are out there and the specifics that kind of discern between these different entities on the continuum. Jefferson M asked, what are some local large-scale processing sites that are most likely to continue operating in the vacuum that was created with the salt lock closing? I don't know, Gil, do you want to take that? Pam, Susanna? Local larger scale processing sites most likely to continue operating.
Local to Brook. I mean, I'm assuming you're local to Gowanus because you're asking
Brooklyn.
about the salt lot, and the
Brooklyn.
answer is there are none. The salt lot was the local process, the local larger scale processing site operating in Brooklyn. I mean, there's still Red Hook. This is an interesting thing. This is a confusing thing. I'm going to try to explain it clearly. The funding that the Compost Project got from Mill, the private donation from the private company, has funded 3 people are still on at Big Reuse. We kept the Queensbridge site open. It's funded some people at the Lower East Side Ecology Center. They're collecting food scraps, and it's funded people at Earth Matter. They have their site open at smaller capacity. Lower East Side Ecology is delivering their scraps to Big Reuse under the Queensbridge, and we're processing it there. I understand that Grow NYC is going to start bringing food scraps to Earth Matter, and they're going to process it there. And so this is an interesting sideline. The Queens Botanic Garden and the New York Botanic Garden, I'm not sure about Snug Harbor, but those two, New York Botanic and Queens Botanic, have confirmed that composting is an integral part of the process of being a horticultural botanic garden. And they have kept on 1 or 2 of the former New York City Compost Project staff. I know at Queens Botanic Garden, they are still processing food scraps, mostly the collected horticultural waste from the garden itself, but also they have their food scrap drop off in the parking lot up there in Flushing.
Gil, I don't want to interrupt, but Susanna wants to add on to what you're saying. And
great. That's what I was hoping would happen.
Yeah, thanks, Gil. I just wanted to share in terms of Staten Island that out of the 7 people that we have, we've let go of 1 part-timer. We are committed to continuing, though we have ceased with acceptance But as we know, processing is about an 18-month process. So we're continuing to process until we can understand what is happening with funding and we can get additional funding for staffing. But we remain committed. It's just a very quickly shifting landscape. So we continue to be committed to processing, and we'll begin accepting again in May.
I'll also add that the Red Hook Farm has also affirmed that composting is an integral part of their operations, and they are committed to at least part-time hiring a compost manager for the farm to continue composting at the Red Hook Compost site.
But to clarify, Gil, Red Hook is only processing on Fridays. They've shut down Saturdays until March.
Yeah, so everything is scaled way back. If you're used to volunteering at any of these sites, you need to get in touch with them and find out when their volunteer days. I know that Earth Matter is only doing one day. I think it's Friday as well. Yeah, Red Hook Farm used to do multiple days. Now they're just doing their one. It's because of staff. We don't have enough staff to do all the things that we used to do. And more specifically to that question, I think the Red Hook Farm is the processing site that's local, but in general, they're all closed.
I can answer for the Bronx. There's not many processing sites in the Bronx. The biggest one is at Lehman College that is managed by one person, and she's amazing. But there's a couple of community gardens that are processing, but again, this is all very small scale. And like I mentioned in the chat, the Bronx has very low participation rates in terms of composting, which is why we need more education and outreach. So these sites that are operating as food scrap drop-offs and community gardens don't get a lot of people dropping off food scraps on a daily basis. So, yeah, just to answer your question.
Thank you, Pam. I don't see any new questions.
Oh, there are some questions there. There's
there's
one
a lot of
question from Sharon about she's hoping full funding will be restored. Her community compost group wouldn't exist if not for the support of the compost projects. But if it's not restored, are there tools and equipment that groups could get? Feels a bit like an ambulance chaser, but she'd hate for that equipment and supplies not to be used. I think that's a little premature, but I'll let you or Gil answer that one.
Thank you, Claire. And if you can manage that, I don't have access to those questions. So
I don't think that the Compost Project has like a back storage area of tools. You know, when project partners request tools and we actually get them for the groups that we're supporting, we distribute them basically immediately. There's not a warehouse full of tools that are going to go unused. Funny enough, I was at the Big Reuse warehouse yesterday when some DSNY employees came to get all of the materials that the outreach associates used to use, and now they're going to have to store them in their tiny offices at Beaver Street. There's a question about where can one in Staten Island North Shore bring their compost at this current time? Susanna, might you know the question to that? Does anybody know? Because there's another question about when Snug Harbor will reopen their collection site.
Gil, can you restate the question? I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of family dinner, so I'm sorry for the distraction. What's the question again?
It might not be up your alley because it's a Staten Island question, but where can people in Staten Island, specifically the North Shore, bring their compost right now? And another one.
There's a couple of places you can go that are still open. There's Olivet Garden, which is over at Broadway and Forest. Skyline Garden is still accepting, which is over by Skyline Park. You can look that up and see where that is. There's also, we hope to be reopening shortly to be accepting if we can finish some agreements. So we hope to square that away in the next month or so. And you can look on the Where to Compost Food Scraps Near Me, the website that's in place, and all of those sites should be up to date from when we last checked. So all of our partners that are continuing should be there on the site.
And I think we should end, because we're almost at time, Gil, with some of these questions about how can people help? Can the city council, does it have the power to bring back funding starting July 1st? You know, and what can people do?
Yeah, I'll start that, Gil, Claire, and we've all spoken about this at the last few teach-ins because everyone has asked about what we can do. We do not believe this should be privately funded. We believe it should be publicly funded, and we are very cognizant that we are in a dire place. So after, as we've said several times, we'll be sending out resources. Part of those resources will be getting together a fundraising committee who would be interested in helping us support and figure out how to raise funds to get us to June and to continue this fight, which has to be funded. I think in addition to that, Claire, the second part of that question was not just about, was about city council members, correct?
Yeah, and policy and
Yeah. I think that's really important. I'll let Gil or Claire yourself speak to that. But just to be clear, our council members have been huge activists and allies in this fight, really standing with us in solidarity. They came to many of our rallies and have spoken out and written letters. They are definitely on our side. And I think the next step is really legislation, because city funding cannot supplement this kind of money. They don't have those budgets, and those budgets shouldn't be taken away from smaller local organizations that are specific to different neighborhoods and districts.
you meant city council funding in that last
sorry, what
place.
did I say?
You said city funding.
Yes, city council. Thank you.
funding.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
because I think city council are trying to get the budget back. It's a whole negotiation process that runs through April or June, I believe. And then they're also looking at if there are legislative ways of ensuring that, you know, there was a zero waste bill. There was a bill that called for all these food scrap drop-offs in every borough, but DSNY are interpreting that as the smart bins. But so there's a lot of city council members working on this, and if you can stay involved with the Save Our Compost Instagram and all these things, we will definitely be reaching out when there are things to support, but we will also be sending an email with more follow-up.
Can I give a quick update on our program?
Yes.
So I saw a question about the Master Composter course. So we've been transitioned into the Bronx Green Up department at NYPG. So we're going to teach a community composting certificate course. It's going to be a cohort model again, but we want to make sure we give the opportunity for folks that didn't finish the course to complete their course. So everyone's welcome to apply, even though priority will be given to Bronx residents. And also there are people that have finished all the requirements, like the courses and the field trips. If you have volunteer hours missing, you're welcome to complete them here with us in the Bronx. I think an email is going out shortly about that from Debbie at DSNY.
Oh, that's great news.
Yeah, it is. We hope to start the course in March, and we're going to start the application process in the beginning of February. So just to put that out there. Oh, and we're also hosting an event in March called Crazy for Composting, where the theme will be the past, present, and future of community composting in New York City. And I hope all of you can make it. It's going to be a great event.
That's great that you have some opportunities for folks up in the Bronx. To answer Howard's question, there is no website that lists all the volunteer events. Department of Sanitation has thoroughly and completely removed any comment or mention of the New York City Compost Project or any resources that one used to have through their website. So they will not be giving you opportunities to finish your master composting program because they don't care.
Yeah, I hear Debbie though is reaching out to about 70 people that need volunteer hours. And
yeah, it's unclear if she's doing that as a person or as an employee of DSNY.
Yeah, that's unclear.
Great. So I think we should wrap up. If anybody has any last words that wants to share, Gil or Anneliese or Susanna.
I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everyone's questions. I hope that this was helpful for folks. And we will be doing another one of these in Manhattan
On Saturday.
on Saturday.
We also will be continuing to be present in Brooklyn and in the Bronx with Pam, the event that she just mentioned. So there's a lot of times that we'll be around. Save Our Compost Coalition is kind of open to all. So please reach out with any follow-up questions. We're happy to direct you to the right source if we don't have it ourselves.
And jump
Thank-
onto the Save Our Compost Coalition. Join us to save our compost.
And thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.